IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Arjun, and today we're going to be talking about something very interesting. We're going to be talking about online fantasy sports and a recent ban on online gambling by the Karnataka government. Today, I have with me Atish. So he wrote an article about online fantasy sports and the ban on online gambling, which was with respect to the Karnataka government's new amended law. So we want to get into the conversation about what effects this might have on the industry as a whole, and is it the right step, and what challenges regulation of this industry might face in the future. So Atish, I just wanted to ask you first of all, what is this law exactly, and what is the difference between online fantasy sports and actual gambling or online gambling? So if you could just give us an overview on that, it would be great.
Hi, Arjun. Thanks for having me. Yes. So the reason why I wrote this article when I did was because the Karnataka government amended its Police Act to ban all forms of gambling, including online gambling. And there are certain clauses within the law which make it very difficult for online fantasy sports to continue to work properly as an industry within the state. And to understand that, as you said, we must understand that there is a difference between online fantasy sports and gambling. So, online fantasy sports, for those who might not know, it's whenever if you've been watching the IPL, you'll see that we are just inundated with the ads of Dream 11 or Paytm's first games, My Circle 11. It just keeps going on, where you can make your own virtual teams on these apps by betting some money. Betting is not the right word, actually. By investing some money in it, you can choose players, make a team out of it, and if they perform well in the match, you get to earn money. And it's an industry that used to be something that was like really niche and really small, but now, just as I said, if you're watching the IPL, you'll see that that's all that, you know, that that's the ads that we are seeing all the time when we're watching IPL. And it became so big that in 2020, Dream 11 was the title sponsor for the Indian Premier League, right? It was called Dream 11 IPL. So that's how big the industry is beginning to become in India right now. And the difference between these two is simply that there's this test that the Indian judiciary uses to determine whether something qualifies as gambling or not, which is called a game of chance versus game of skill. And in a game of chance, the best way you can understand whether something is a game of chance or a game of skill is if you observe the pattern of rewards accrued by a user over time. So what happens in a game of skill is if you are playing that game over a period of time, your rewards are likely to increase because you learn how to play the game. You develop the skill to play that game. On the other hand, in a game of chance, your rewards will not multiply over time. There will be no correlation between playing it for longer and earning more money, because there is no element of skill involved. It's entirely chance based or largely chance based. So a good example of a chance based game would be something like a lottery. When you enter a lottery, there is nothing you can do to influence your chances of winning that game. On the other hand, stock market, if you enter the stock market, that's not a game, of course, but uh, the way you invest, where you invest, determines how much money you're likely to make or lose, right? So your conscious, your agency and your choice actually determine or have some say in determining whether or not you will be rewarded. Now, what is important to understand is this difference between these two things does not mean that a game of skill has no element of chance involved, or a game of chance cannot have any element of skill involved. The idea is which plays the overwhelming majority of a part in determining the outcome. So even in a actual sport like cricket, chance has a role to play. Like right up front, tosses or pitch conditions, they have a role to play, and a lot of it is entirely chance based. Yet you cannot call cricket a game of chance. It's a sport of skill. So the important distinction in this framework of skill and chance is which is the predominant factor. Is it skill or chance? And in online fantasy sports, it's quite obvious that it's a game of skill, in the sense that for anyone to make a team in this and actually make some money, they will have to know a lot about cricket, first of all, especially T20 cricket. They have to understand the metrics of the sport, how, which players are in form, and most importantly, some nuances of the game. For example, in T20, wickets during a power play are far more valuable than wickets during the death. So, in the death, what is more valuable is dot balls than wickets often. So, what kind of player would you be going for? Right? Someone that takes wickets up front, for example. So, stuff like that. You have to have a lot of domain knowledge in order to actually make money off this game. So, it's quite clearly a game of skill.
That's really interesting. I mean, the equating online fantasy sports to online gambling is something that is kind of overlooked, I guess, because when you just say that you're making money off an app like Dream11, or something which involves sports and skills in the domain, it's still perceived as gambling because it's about the money. So there's this whole conceptual difference between the game of skill and the game of chance, and I think the government still hasn't kind of figured out which is which. So the ban is like a blanket ban on everything that involves money. So that's really interesting to know. What I wanted to ask you next is about the whole industry as like a nascent developing one in the country. You mentioned, right? So it was still it was still very developing before, but then now it's grown to a very good extent because of IPL and EPL and what different sporting leagues around the world. So what effect would this kind of ban, if it's enacted across the entire country? Now it's just Karnataka, or maybe in the future a few more states might enact the same ban. So what do you think would be the impact of this as a whole on the industry, economically, financially, and would it kind of put like a constraint on it for developing to a better extent? So is this something like detrimental in that way?
Right. So, before we go into that, actually, the Karnataka law, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So, the the law is strange in a way, right? Because while it was being passed, the chief minister said that the law will not go after or will not prohibit games that are completely skill based, right? Yet in the law there is a clause which says, and I quote, the amended law also so the amended law also puts betting on the skills of others in the category of gambling, and states that, and I quote, any act of risking money or otherwise on the unknown result of an event, including on a game of skill, is an offense. So for that means, and the law is a ban on online gambling. So you would think it does not apply to online fantasy sport, but then it also has this clause which says that it also prohibits any act of risking money on the unknown result of another event on another person's skill, right? Including a game of skill. So that's a very ambiguous statement in the sense that you're not really sure now whether or not online fantasy sports come under this or not, because they have failed to make explicit they have not especially stated that it does not apply to online fantasy sports. And this clause seems to suggest that it does apply to online fantasy sports. So the industries, the people running these platforms like Dream 11, My Circle 11, all of those, they find themselves in a tizzy because they are not really sure whether this law applies to them or not. And that incentivizes over compliance, because if you are in a situation where you are confused whether or not the service you're offering is legal or not, because the law does not explicitly state that, then you are likely to over comply, because otherwise, and the law has some really harsh measures. It extends the prison sentence. That was originally the fine has been increased massively. So the punishments for not complying with the law are really high. So if you're a person running one of these platforms and you are just incentivized to, block access to people from Karnataka, and that is what we have seen is happening. So as of October 6th, for example, which was when I wrote the article, uh, Mobile Premier League and Paytm First Games had blocked access to Karnataka users. Dream 11, which is the largest player in the market, had it. But day before yesterday actually, so that will be 10th of October. On 10th of October, someone filed an FIR against Dream 11, and now they have also blocked access to Karnataka-based users. So it's shutting down. And now coming to your question about other states, actually, Karnataka is not the first state. In fact, there's been a long history of Indian states going after these games right since they started becoming popular. Tamil Nadu has tried to ban them. Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Odisha. There's a lot of states that have tried to ban the games, and multiple times various high courts have ruled that these are games of skill and cannot be classified as gambling. And therefore, certain laws were challenged by these courts. The Supreme Court has upheld the decision by the Rajasthan High Court, which ruled that these are games of skill and therefore cannot be classified as gambling and cannot just be banned like that. Supreme Court has upheld that. Even then, states are going forward, as Karnataka has most recently, in trying to not explicitly ban them, but bury them under ambiguity. And then, because they can always say that, we are not explicitly banning them, but we know how this is going to play out. As I said, like they have already banned access to people in Karnataka, even though the law does not explicitly state whether or not online fantasy games are banned or not. So a lot of states are doing that. And yeah, it is likely to have a lot of economic impact. And the irony is the economic impact was, in fact, identified by the union government's think tank, which is the Niti Aayog. The Niti Aayog in December 2020 released a report about fantasy sports in India, in which they have staggering figures. So the industry has grown massively. So it has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 212% between 2016 and 2019. And it had 2 million users in June 2016, and it became 90 million users in December 2019. And I'm directly quoting from the draft paper, which we will link in the description of this show, from the document by Niti Aayog. And this is becoming a huge industry. There are likely to be many jobs created from this in the next 2-3 years. It'll get around 10,000 crore in foreign investment, according to the studies that Niti Aayog report cites. And it's also likely to get around 10,000 crore at least in taxes over the next 5 years. So it's an economy, it's an industry of considerable size, especially one that is, entirely, tech driven, innovative. And when we also think about it from the sense that, over the last few years, one of the driving factors of the dispensation in Delhi has been Digital India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, where, they even have an Atmanirbhar app challenge, right? Where new and new tech innovation, new and new tech solutions are being rewarded, are being looked at as something that India should be becoming a leader at. And yet we see that within one state government in India, you see, and not just one, right? Across so many different state governments in India, you see this disconnect between what the union government's think tank thinks is a very good idea, a very good industry that might grow, and but the states are going after them, trying to ban them. And it's likely to have a lot of economic like setbacks, as I said, because especially in Karnataka, which is actually one of those states that is in the forefront of tech innovations and new startups in the country, right? And there are many users from Karnataka on these apps who, and there's a lot of money, a lot of transactions being done on it, and now all of that is lost. So there will be economic impact, as the document from Niti Aayog itself outlines.
That's really interesting. Before we go on, let's just take a short break and we'll be right back.
Artificial intelligence, what is that? It sure sounds like science fiction, but it's very much a part of our world today. But most of us lack understanding and a means to use AI to our advantage. Luckily, though, Intel's Digital Readiness Program empowers everyone with skill sets, mindsets, and tool sets to use in an AI-fueled world, so you don't end up like me. The Intel AI for Youth program is an initiative that guides today's youth to an understanding of AI, how it is designed, and why it's important today. Intel's been working with the CBSE, Ministry of Education, and the Government of India to empower today's youth to build social impact solutions while demystifying what AI is. How do you take advantage of this? Purchase an Intel Core-powered PC and you get free access to 80 plus hours of immersive and hands-on training about AI. On completion of the program, along with a certificate, you get access to AI toolsets to try put what you learn to good use. Log on to futurebanaowonderful.intel.com. Future Banao Wonderful by bringing home an Intel-powered PC.
Welcome back. I mean, the whole fact that this is just another industry which is coming up and there are so many restrictions already being placed upon it is something that should be of concern. But I just wanted to know something else. So, if when a new industry comes up, there should always be compliance and regulation and how to make the growth of the industry more sustained. So you talked about the compliance costs with respect to this particular law, especially which was passed by the Karnataka government. And the cost of not complying to it is pretty high. I mean, no one wants to risk it. So would you think that this is going in the direction of over regulation of the whole industry? Is it just like a beginning wherein other states also continue to do this, and so instead of building like a robust regulatory framework, we're going in the direction of just kind of regulating anything and everything which is possible? So that would also have like an impact on the entire online fantasy sports in India. And what do you think the regulatory framework or like the ideal regulatory framework should be for a industry like this?
Yeah, so like as much as the Karnataka law that we have been talking about gets it wrong in the sense that it's overarching and ambiguous, it does identify something crucial. And this is an industry for all its promise. It also has some issues that need to be addressed. There are issues of addiction. As in any other engaging anything that has money involved or anything else that has engaging content involved in it. It can be addictive. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And many of these platforms are trying to address it. There are also other issues of data protection, of fraud, because, there are many other smaller players in the industry that could be coming up, right? Because it's an industry currently that's very much, it's a very recent industry, especially in India, because, in India, the culture around, betting on sports or any involvement of money and sports has always been looked at with great suspicion, thanks to the long history of fixing in cricket, especially in the subcontinent. And, there's always been a hush hush industry. And then, tech innovation comes up and it's promising. It does not look exploitative. But even then, the fact is, it's an industry that's new. So there are these challenges that need to be looked at. So these exist. And there is also challenges that are not exactly from the point of view of the apps themselves, but from India's own, how the Indian state functions, or how India's policy making functions. Because for for this law, and I in my article I use this law as a example to draw upon some of the larger themes that we see in India's policy making in general, right? And those are other challenges that regulation of proper regulation of these apps is going to face in India. So there are these challenges in the apps that you have to address, of addiction, of fraud, all of that. But in order to do that, first of all, you need to understand that this is an industry that has promise, right? You have to understand that you need to regulate it to protect users from being exploited by it, but you don't need to protect users from their own agency, right? Because when you're banning something, you go outright and ban something, which is what India's policy response to many innovative tech platforms often is. When you go outright and ban it, what you're actually telling people is, you don't exactly know what you're doing, so we'll decide on your behalf. You're not allowed to do this, right? But a better way to address challenges is to allow this industry to exist and then identify what are the challenges and then solve it. And there have been attempts to do that. So the same Niti Aayog report that I was quoting from, before the report came out, they actually held there was a meeting between many of the proprietors of these platforms, of the online fantasy sports platforms. With the Niti Aayog, there was a roundtable, I think there was conference, they all discussed what various challenges associated with it. There were many principles that they came upon, recommendations to the union government about what are the principles that should drive regulation in this industry. And according to them, it should be self-regulated. There is already a body, that's an industry body, that represents online fantasy sport platforms. So they want self-regulation. You can also make an argument for, you know, it not being self-regulated, and there being, laws formulated by the union government that apply to these. But you can even begin to have that argument only after these are not banned arbitrarily in some parts of India and not in other parts of India, right? Because states have this power to do this because of the Public Gambling Act of 1867, which states have been using so far to arbitrarily ban or try to ban these games. And therefore, this industry is unable to grow. So in order for it to be regulated properly, first of all, we have to decide whether or not, there has to be some sort of uh, pan-Indian union level legislation or recommendations or rules that need to be formulated, so that there is continuity of and consistency of policy responses across Indian states. Because it doesn't make any sense for a for a proprietor of these platforms to have an incentive to grow within the country if they can operate in Uttar Pradesh but not in Karnataka, for example, or if they can operate in Bihar but not in Tamil Nadu. Like, why they would want to operate across the country? It's just much easier, much better that way. So these are the challenges with the regulatory aspect. And as I said, they show in some of the problems consistent with India's broader, policy making practices. Because you look at technology with suspicion. Because one of the very telling things about the Karnataka law was it has two exceptions. One is betting on horse racing and lottery, right? And that just seemed very funny to me, because I have no experience, of course, betting in horse racing or betting of any form. But from what I could fathom, betting on horse racing does seem to be a game of skill, in the sense that it does involve some strategy, some cognitive ability, and is not chance dependent entirely, right? And they can see that it's a well established practice. It's an industry by itself. In Bangalore, in Kolkata, many of these colonial cities, it's still an activity that goes on, right? So they have given it an exception. No one's going to be arrested if they are going to be betting on sport, on horse racing. And yet, when the same principle of someone spending money, investing money on the outcome of a sport that involves skill is applied on an online high tech contest to online fantasy sports, that is suddenly banned. So that just shows how we have often been treating many of these technology solutions in a stepmotherly fashion. Like we look at it as suspicion, even though the core principle is the same as horse racing, where you are just betting on the outcome or the skills of the people involved in an actual sport. But one of them is allowed, one of them is banned. And the second one was lottery, which is entirely a game of chance. And partly, I think it is legal because in states like Kerala, for example, lottery is entirely state run. And I think the Kerala government makes quite a bit of money from having people enter lotteries. It's a source of revenue. But I think in case of Karnataka, one of the things that I think might have driven their law, and I'm speculating, is the fact that there is very little risk of you losing money in a lottery, in the sense that a lottery ticket is very, very cheap, right? You don't have to, you're not going to go bankrupt in a lottery. But that is again an inconsistent way of looking at policy, because at the end of the day, a lottery is still a game of chance. How much money you put into it does not really matter, because by design, whether something is a game of skill or a game of chance is a function of how the game is designed. It has nothing to do with how much money you're investing in it. So there is a lack of consistency that is being applied. So you will ban something else, which is a game of chance, because people are investing more money in it, but you will not ban something like lottery for being a game of chance, because people don't invest a lot of money in it. And that's just seems to me to be very inconsistent. And these are the larger regulatory problems, I think, sound specific to the industry, but many more of them specific to just how India looks at regulation, looks at these things, equates gambling, equates any form of investing money in something where there is risk involved as gambling, then taking gambling and looking at it as if it's, substance abuse or something, and then just passing a paternalistic law banning it. It's just a very hard, it's like a huge hammer to beat it with. It's not a great tool to formulate policy.
Well, that was very enlightening. Thank you so much, Atish, for that. I mean, there are so many inherent things that we have to change with respect to regulation and how to view all these industry and look at it with a little bit of more nuance rather than just black and white saying this is that, and just putting it into two different buckets and just banning one. So I think I learned a lot today. I mean, there's so much more we can do, especially with growing industries like online fantasy sports, and lot more the government can do with respect to how it can foster the growth of these industry and ensure that people who are actually contributing to these industries with respect to, let's say, being a part of it or developing these softwares or and anything else, who are investing to create these kind of games, should be kind of at least taken into account before they can outright ban the entire concept. So that was a very fun episode. So thank you so much, Atish. Look forward to knowing more about this in the future whenever the government decides to, regulate the online fantasy sports industry, and hopefully kind of like not create the divide between the union and the states, with a few states banning it and a few states not banning it. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks. And before I go, it's really strange in the sense that the way the Niti Aayog approached it made me very hopeful about the fact that that there was actual consultation with the industry, there was deliberation. The entire draft that they published for comments, which is still available on their website, it's a very good first look at an industry that needs to be reckoned with. And on the other hand, just various states just randomly pass a law because they and in Karnataka, I think people attempted suicide after losing money, and some people lost a lot of their money, some people died. And as a response, the government just goes out and bans it. So this disconnect is what makes me like really, I don't know. On one hand, I was hopeful about the Niti Aayog thing, but then when there's this kind of disconnect between two different parts of the larger Indian state, it just seems very strange. So I hope that changes in the future, because the way it's being approached by the union government's think tank should be the approach we should be following towards regulating any new innovative industry that comes up, because oftentimes we might not be able to understand how it properly works, because a lot of technology is like that. A lot of us might not be able to understand what exactly is going on. And there might be risks of addiction and of fraud and data protection, but the response should not be an outright ban. And I think that's just a lesson that should be taken from this on Karnataka law. I hope it gets repealed, because I don't see it like it will be legally challenged, and the precedent is that they will rule in favor of the online fantasy sport platforms, but one can only speculate and hope. So yeah, hopefully it's a good lesson. Thanks for having me.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Atish, and see you guys in the next episode. Thanks. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcasting Network. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi speak to gynecologist Sakina Radiowala on the important aspects of the female body, like menstruation, biological clock, infections, and hygiene. Dr. Sakina also answers some crowdsourced questions during this episode. Dr. Siddhant Bhargava, fitness and nutritional scientist, co-founder of Food Darzi, explains how we can simplify our nutrition on The Habit Coach with Ashton. On Smile India, Shifa tells us the amazing story of Dr. Aparna Hegde's NGO Arman. They provide free counseling to pregnant women and new mothers in their local languages. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Gaurav Agarwal, co-founder of GameZop. They discuss the conduit between game developers and large platforms. And on Hanswani, here's Sushma Munindra's story, Ye Ishq Ishq Hai, Ishq Ishq, which explores how love is perceived differently by two different generations in the voice of Shashwata Sharma. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you enjoyed this show, or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. We appreciate the word of mouth. And finally, we'd like to thank the sponsors on our network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda Quarter, CoinSwitch Kuber, Slay Coffee, Intel, and Kotak Mahindra Bank. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.